Hello, and thank you for joining me today for another presentation as part of the GreyLearning Webinar Series. Today I'm going to be talking about my 10 favorite photos, and most importantly, what those photos taught me, what the process of capturing those photos taught me, or what just working with those images taught me at some point. I know many of you are already very familiar with me. I know many of you are repeat attendees, have joined for a number of GreyLearning webinars, and I thank you for that. And if you're not so familiar, if you're joining me for the first time, welcome, and be sure to check out timgrayphoto.com for more. You can learn about GreyLearning and the many video training courses that we have there. The daily question and answer email for photographers, the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter, which shocked, maybe surprised to say that I've been publishing that email for something like 16 years now. I think it's going on 17 years, which is just wild. I do want to thank Tamron for sponsoring the GreyLearning Webinar Series, for making this series of presentations possible, making it absolutely free for photographers to attend. So thank you to Tamron for that. Be sure, if you haven't already, to check out the fun video series they've put together, One Location, One Lesson, One Lens, which you can find on the Tamron channel on YouTube. That's youtube.com/TamronVids. So again, today I'm here to talk about favorite photos. And so this actually is not a favorite photo, but I wanted to use this image to sort of talk about the concept of a favorite photo. One of the most important things that I want to clarify first is that a favorite photo does not necessarily mean a best photo. So I'm not going to show you the images that I think are my absolute best photos, my portfolio, you might say, but rather photos that have become favorites, personal favorites of mine. You might not think they're among my best work. In some cases, a couple of cases, I hope that you don't think some of these photos are among my best work. But again, favorite in this context really just means that it's a personal favorite, that it's meaningful in some way to me. And in many respects, for me personally, part of what makes a photo special, a favorite, is that I did learn something or had some unique experience. And that's actually why I'm showing you this photo here. This photo, I would argue, is perhaps not that great a photo. Now, icebergs are cool. The color is very nice in the icebergs. The texture, the play of light and shadow is wonderful. The sky's a bit drab. The backdrop is a little dreary. In theory, that helps to emphasize the colors and texture in that foreground subject. But the reason that this photo could have nearly been a favorite, and quite frankly, why I thought it was going to be a favorite when I captured it, really has to do with two things. One minor and one more major, in my view anyway. The minor one is that these are icebergs, and that's a pretty interesting subject. I mean, a big piece of ice floating in the ocean, that's pretty cool. I think it's a unique subject, or at least an interesting subject. But the real reason that this photo sort of got elevated in status in my mind is that this photo was captured right off the coast of Antarctica, off the peninsula of Antarctica. And so just the very fact that I knew that I was essentially in Antarctica when I captured this photo made the photo that much more special, made the experience that much more special. It's, in some respects, just ice, surrounded by water. But just knowing where I was on the map, to me, and part of it is my own bias that I'm really into maps and I'm really into traveling, and so where I am maybe is a little more meaningful than it might be to others. But that's what made that experience really special. And so I think one of the things to keep in mind is that there are many reasons why a photo might become a favorite. So let's take a look at my 10 favorite photos together. Actually, if I'm being completely honest, there's going to be 11. And the reason for that is a little bit of a minor detail. Here is that bonus image. And the reason this is not one of my favorite photos, it doesn't count as one of, quote unquote, my 10 favorite photos, is because I didn't actually take this picture. And yet, this certainly counts as one of my favorite photos in general. And the reason is, you couldn't tell because my hand is blocking my face and the photo is out of focus and it's an old 4x6 print from film from, I don't even want to think about how long ago this was, but that's a little tiny two-seater Cessna 152, and that's me at the controls. And this is shortly after I'd gotten my pilot's license a long, long time ago, and my stepfather, who essentially raised me as, served as my father, if you will. He was a big guy, 6'6", I think 250 pounds. He had the deep voice to go with it. He worked in construction. I mean, this is like the epitome of a tough guy. But he would not go for a ride in a little Cessna 152 with me. I guess a little bit of fear had set in, this tough guy, but he was scared. And yet, it's one of my cherished memories of my stepfather, who unfortunately passed away a handful of years ago. And it's just one of those moments, where it wasn't the person that I thought I knew. And so, it was just very, very, a very special day, a memorable day anyhow. And it's just one of those memories that I hold on to. And the reason I share that is that to me, this is one of the first and foremost reasons that I actually capture photographic images in the first place. And that is to say that I capture photos first and foremost to preserve cherished memories. And I think actually that it is part of why I started capturing photos in the first place. My earliest memory of photography is taking a camera, a little point-and-shoot camera, film, of course, a very long time ago, to Disneyland. I grew up in Southern California, and so I'd periodically get to go to Disneyland, and I would take a camera to document the fact that I was at Disneyland, and I would take pictures of the rides. And so for me, photography started out as a way of sort of documenting, but I realized later on it's not really just so much about documenting, it's about preserving those memories and providing me with the opportunity to go back and review those memories later on. So let's get to the actual 10 favorite photos and the lessons that I learned along the way. First and foremost, some of you have, I'm sure, already seen this photo, an oak tree. And this actually was the very first photo that I was proud of. Of course, then I quickly learned a couple of lessons. It made me not quite so proud. First, later in life, this was captured in high school. So this was during my high school years when I suddenly was told by my guidance counselor that I was at risk of not being eligible to graduate because I did not have enough elective credits, which I thought was just plain silly, until I realized this is a wonderful opportunity. I can take a bunch of easy, fun classes for a semester. Basically, it's almost like having a semester off. And so I was able to take 3 elective courses, and those were photography, journalism, and being a teacher's aide during one period. It wasn't until something like 10 years later that I realized when I was given the opportunity to take any kind of fun class I wanted, that it was photography, journalism or writing, and essentially teaching, which of course is how I make a living these days and have for quite a while. And so that was sort of a fun realization. But back to this photo. So back in high school, I took this picture. I had this, I was walking, this happens to be in California, Malibu Creek State Park, where they filmed the old TV show MASH. And walking up a trail, turn around, and there's this tree behind me, and I see the sun glinting through the branches, the leaves up at the top. And so I set up my tripod and take a picture because, back in high school, I was actually following the rules, at least in photography class, and used a tripod. And so set it up, take a picture, and move on. Because, of course, back in the film days, you didn't really know what you got. And so it wasn't until I got back to class the following week and developed the film that I could see the starburst. And I said, well, I have to make a print of this. And so I made a print of the image, an 8x10 print. And when I saw the image coming up on the paper, which was always, of course, a magical experience, I'm sure many of you have had that wonderful experience, but that's when I first realized there were clouds in the background. And I was so excited. And I went to my photography teacher, Mrs. Bauer, look what the sun did, and look at those clouds. And of course, she wasn't shocked, or rather she knew the reason, and she explained that if you stop down the lens aperture with a nice crisp point of light, such as the sun on a clear day, that you'll get a starburst effect. And I thought that was just amazing. And that's probably part of the reason that I love starbursts even to this day, even though I know it's kind of a cliche thing. But I later realized, wait, I should have known. I should have known how my equipment worked. And I should have known there were clouds in the frame. So as a photographer, it's important that we understand our equipment and that we really pay attention to the subject. Now, in this context, with this example, I'm talking about knowing what's in the frame, realizing that there's clouds off in the distance so that something is not a surprise in the frame, whether it's a good thing, such as those clouds I was happy about, or a problem, a blemish, or some distraction that's sticking into the frame. And so paying attention, and part of that also goes beyond just what's in the frame, taking that a step further and deciding, do I want that in the frame? And also paying attention to the behavior of a subject. So, for example, if you're a wildlife photographer, understanding the behavior of animals. And so taking the time to really give your full attention to the subject and to understand your equipment. Those were very valuable lessons. I was glad to have the opportunity with a great photography teacher in high school to learn some of these lessons early on so that I could apply those lessons throughout my life in photography. So speaking of growing up in Southern California, another favorite image was captured there. And I'll never forget the first time I shared this photo in public. When I was just getting started teaching, lecturing, presenting at events, I was at an event for the North American Nature Photography Association, which I guess first and foremost, a sidestep lesson here, I should have been more aware of who my audience was. I'm presenting to a group of nature photographers and I show this image. When I showed this image, though, I felt like it was a good image. Maybe even almost great because, I didn't know any better. This was a long time ago. I was much younger and more foolish then. And so I presented this thinking that the audience would perhaps even gasp like, wow, what a really unique photo. Instead, I could hear someone in the audience telling his neighbor, probably assuming that I could not hear him, and he said, "It's not even in focus." Now, in my mind, I thought, well, that's the whole point. The photo is not in focus because it was captured with a lens baby, and so you get this sweet spot in the middle that is in focus, and then, well, you can position where you want that sweet spot, but in this case, roughly in the middle, and then it fades off with this, kind of blurry effect. And I thought it was kind of cool. Really, I was just playing around with this lens baby way back in the day when they had first come out. And I happened to photograph this scene, and I thought it came out pretty cool. But it wasn't till later. Really, at first it was almost, you might say, a little hurtful that I hear this guy saying something disparaging about my photo. But then I realized that actually it's not the best photo, but it's a favorite of mine. And the reason that this one is a favorite of mine is because it's a photo for me. It's a photo by me, obviously, but this is the sign over the entrance to the pier in Santa Monica, California, and I was born in Santa Monica. And as a child, I would sit in the sand in the shade of the pier and make sandcastles with my grandmother. And I have great memories of my grandmother related to the Santa Monica Pier. She lived not too far away. And I realized when I came to the realization that this wasn't such a great photo, but that I really loved it, that it's important to capture photographs for yourself, not for other people. Now, that's not to say that I don't want other people to enjoy my photographs. I'm not saying that I don't want other people to think I'm a great photographer. I would love for people to think I'm a better photographer than I really am. But my point is that I think that you should be your first customer, as it were. You should be the first audience for your photos, and you should capture photos that you like. Hopefully other people will like them as well, but most important is capture photograph subjects that you like, capture images for yourself first and foremost. So this is obviously another favorite one, in that it's a cherished memory for me. And this was sort of interesting. I've told this story before. Some of you maybe have heard it already. But this was captured in Tokyo, Japan. We spent a night, maybe a couple nights in Tokyo. Really, the focus of the trip was going to be Kyoto, but we went to Tokyo first. And this was what I consider to be the first real photograph that I captured during that trip. We went out and photographed the bright lights of the city just as snapshots, as a tourist, essentially. But this was the first sort of real photo that I captured that first morning in Tokyo. And what was interesting about it was really the experience. So I'm photographing, and this happens to be in a cemetery. And so I'm feeling somewhat self-conscious in that I'm taking pictures in a cemetery. I'm trying to be very respectful, but I don't want anyone to misinterpret what I'm doing. And as I'm capturing these photos, and these are prayer sticks memorializing the anniversary of someone's death, and during this time, an elderly woman across a courtyard gets my attention and waves me over. And she leads me up these stairs to a Buddhist temple. She didn't speak any English. She said one word in English, and I believe it was judgment. It was related to which Buddha this was, which statue this was in this temple. And she proceeded with no language to teach me how to pray at this Buddhist temple, to get the Buddha's attention and make an offering and bow. And it still, to this day, when I tell the story, it gives me goosebumps because it was just such a special connection. And I had such an enjoyable time in Japan. And this was one of the experiences that really stood out, that was really special to me. And the funny thing is that this photo that I captured right before I thought I was getting in trouble from this woman, and instead had this wonderful experience, when I pressed the button, the shutter release on the camera, I thought the photo was going to be great. And you've probably had this experience where you look on the back of the camera and the photo looks great. Then you get it to the computer and you think, oh, it's not as good when I see it on a bigger screen. And so I did some work in post-processing trying to essentially match the feeling of the experience. And so converting to black and white, adding a sepia tone effect to try to get this timeless, kind of old and timeless all at the same time. And then adding a vignette to add some contrast and mystery and just trying to match the mood. And so this was a process of trying to get the photo to match what I felt about the photo, because the photo didn't come out exactly the way I had intended in that respect. It didn't have that feeling of the experience that I was there. But my point really is that first and foremost, I think it is important to start with the experience. In other words, put the experience first. And it's sort of twofold, as I'll talk about with a different photo a little bit later. But one is to actually have the experience in the first place and to prioritize the experience. But the other thing is that I find very often if you lead with the experience, better photos follow. You're sort of more invested in your subject and in the experience. And so I think if you try to focus on having a good experience, an interesting experience, a special experience, whatever it is that that you're interested in having as far as the experience goes. In this case, trying to have sort of a local cultural experience, trying to get more familiar with the culture that I was visiting for the first time. For example, taking a city bus instead of taking a taxi everywhere, and trying the local food instead of eating at the Americanized restaurants at some of the hotels. And putting that experience first, which not only I think helps you get in touch with that subject so that you can capture better photos, but it makes those photographs more meaningful as well. So getting back to that notion of photographing for yourself first and foremost, I think can really help you get better photographs and appreciate your photographs as well. Now, I know many of you know that every year for, I believe it's been 10 years now, maybe even more than 10 years now, I've been leading photography workshops out in the remarkable Palouse region of eastern Washington state. And along the way, of course, we visit this house, this old abandoned farmhouse. I can't tell you how many. I need to, at some point, try and track down all of my pictures of this house and figure out how many times I visited this house and how many times I've photographed it. It's one of my favorite subjects out there. It just has such an interesting look to it. And I have visited, when I get out to the Palouse each year, I go to check on my favorite subjects to make sure they're still there, to find out what the crops are looking like. And this is always one of the first places I go. I've gotten to know the family that owns the property. They always tell us the story about the homestead here, and some of the progression, the changes that have happened over the years. And the funny thing is, I have essentially, in taking my students, my workshop participants to this site, among many other locations that we visit, I always feel like I'm sort of trying to make sure that they get great photos. And I'm essentially always trying to make sure that they can get better photos than I have in the past. And yet, I still find that this photo of this house remains my favorite of this house. Now, part of that is bias, and part of that is just the clouds were especially nice that day, and the wheat looked really good that day. Every year, they don't necessarily have wheat on this property. They'll do some rotation. And so there might be other crops, garbanzo beans, for example, in a given year. And so, the situation changes. The house looks different over the years. It's been weathered year after year, continues to degrade just a little bit. And so the conditions have never quite matched what I had when this photo was captured. And as it turns out, this photo was captured on my very first visit to this house. And so one of the things that taught me is to make the most of your first visit to a subject, because it might provide your best, or in some cases, your only photos. Now, thankfully, this house is still there. We've been able to photograph it every year for the past 10 years or so, under varying weather conditions. And so that's wonderful. Hopefully that house will be there for a long time, continuing to look as special as it does. But not too far away from this house, there's another homestead, essentially around the corner, except out in the Palouse. Wide open spaces around the corner is a little bit of a distance. It might even be as much as a mile away. But in any event, there's another household with a barn, a homestead, that had an abandoned house there as well as a barn. And during the same year, I was able to photograph the barn on that property. The very next time that I visited that barn on a later trip, that barn had fallen down. So I got to photograph a fallen barn, and within a year after that, the barn was all gone. And so it sort of reminds me, number one, sometimes the first time you visit a place or a subject, somehow you're just in a better mindset. For example, when it comes to visiting a particular location, very often I find that, of course, I capture more photos than I need, just because that's what I do. And so I come away from a given location, a given subject, with more images than I really need, and I've got to go through and find my favorite. And I find an incredibly high percentage of the time, my favorite image of a given location or a given subject is either the first photo I captured or the last photo I captured. Either I just got it right the first time and then was playing around trying to find other possible interpretations, or I was sort of working my way toward a solution, a way of framing the subject and a way of composing the scene and setting up the camera settings, etc., so that I finally got it right at the end, and then, okay, now I realize I have my shot and I can move on. And so in some cases, I find that just that first time you're visiting, it's fresh to you. There's that newness of the subject, and so somehow you make better photographs. And sometimes it just turns out to be your only opportunity to photograph. Maybe it's the only time you're going to be in that location, or there's something unique about the location at that particular time. And so trying to make the most of your first and, frankly, all visits to a given subject, making the most of all of your photographs. But I think a special emphasis ought to be played when it comes to making the most of a very first visit to a location. I've often found that that's when I capture my best photos of a given scene. And then I know in the previous webinar I shared this photo and the story that goes with this photo, so I won't go into extensive detail about this, but to make a long story short, I was out photographing birds. This is in Ding Darling in Florida, the wildlife refuge, and right about sunrise, and I had in my mind that I wanted pictures of the birds feeding. You know, when these snowy egrets, well, any of these birds that feed on the water, grabbing fish or shrimp, there's this sort of ballet that happens. And so, you know, they're reaching in or with their beak or their I was going to say talons, but I don't think that would be the right word for an egret. In any event, so grabbing, you know, a fish or shrimp, and so they're kind of dipping in, but never landing on the water. They're just flying by and kind of slowing down and dipping in and flying off, and it really feels like this ballet. And that was the subject I was after, this ballet. Except it's really difficult to photograph a bird, even though, you know, an egret like this is not moving terribly fast and is not, you know, flitting about like, you know, darting back and forth the way a swallow might. But still, it's a reasonably fast-moving bird, all things considered, or a reasonably fast-moving subject. And I'm using a 500mm lens, so just keeping the bird in the frame can be a challenge. And then focusing on the bird, it can be a challenge, and making sure your exposure is right. And so trying to get this image that I thought I wanted of this sort of ballet of the birds feeding, and it just wasn't working. And I was sort of getting frustrated. And then I realized that most of these egrets, when they would sort of finish their little feeding ballet, would continue flying from my right toward my left, and the rising sun, there were some clouds there adding a bit of color, and it just created this wonderful view. And I realized I had been chasing the wrong photograph the entire time. I don't even want to know how long I had spent photographing in the wrong place, so to speak, at the wrong position for these birds. But then I realized that the photograph you're chasing isn't always the best option available, and that it's important to always look for other photographic possibilities. There are always so many different interpretations. It's one of the things I actually love about leading field photography workshops. In some respects, I'm there to help photographers somewhat on the technical side in terms of getting better exposure, etc. And then on the creative side, helping with better compositions. And of course, some photographers need or want a fair amount of help, and some photographers don't. Sometimes the photographer who joins me on a workshop is really, first and foremost, interested in being taken to the right locations at the right time. They, you know, would rather have somebody who's very familiar with an area and who's done all the research and has visited the place and knows the place and can tell you, you know, time of day and lighting conditions and sky conditions, etc., where you'd want to be and what sort of photographs you'll want to capture. But at the same time, I don't want for my workshop participants to just have a checklist, to just be out there photographing the same images that I've captured. I want them to create their own unique interpretations. And I certainly encourage that. But of course, some photographers don't need any encouragement at all. That's exactly what they want, is to capture their own unique interpretations. And sometimes, I'll tell you, it is shocking. After a workshop or during a workshop, if we do image critiques, some of the photos that I see in places that I have visited, you know, I've been running photo workshops in the Palouse for about 10 years now. And you sort of, after you visited a place so many times, almost feel like I've captured all the photos that can be captured here. I mean, you catch yourself and realize that's silly. But sometimes the different perspectives are shockingly different from anything I've ever done or anything I ever thought about. New York City, we also run photo workshops in New York City, where I've lived for the past, I think it's been about 8 years now. And so I've gotten to know this city pretty well. And yet, you know, wandering down some of my favorite streets and leading photographers along the way, and then seeing what they come up with later, always very different. And it's amazing. It's wonderful. It's a lot of fun. But it also serves as a reminder for, well, what I'm talking about here, obviously, is that there's always so many other possibilities. Different photographers will find different photographs among the same subject or scene. And similarly, you should sort of push yourself to find different possibilities. When you've got the photo that you wanted, play around a little bit and see if you can come up with other photographs that might be interesting as well. And then another photo that I've shared on more than one occasion, one of my great memories. This was on the first visit I ever made to Austria. During the very first visit, the very first day that I had visited Hallstatt, this little town, this tiny town in the Alps. So going back to that previous tip about making the most of the first time you're visiting a particular location or subject, the first time you have an opportunity to photograph a particular subject. And as I've told the story before, for those of you who've heard it, of course, you'll be familiar that it took me a little while to find this view of Hallstatt, and I was sort of struggling with it a little bit. Driving through the Alps to get here, first of all, is just remarkable. The mountains are just gorgeous, and they seem to rise straight up. And so that by itself is great. And then this quaint little town, just a charming little town that is on this tiny little sliver, not even on the sliver. You see how quickly the mountains rise up behind the town. And so there's this very narrow strip of land that is reasonably flat, and then it quickly rises up, but they've got houses and other buildings going right up the hillside as well. In fact, up above, there's a salt mine. But it's a really unique and interesting looking place. And so, of course, when you go to a town, you're mostly in the town. I was off on the outskirts. We had to park just outside of the main part of town. And so walking essentially along the lakefront here, realizing that, that was a good vantage point, but just not finding the angle that conveyed how impressed I was by this location. I mean, I was just in awe of the mountains, of the little town, the big lake. It was just really spectacular. And I was struggling. And finally, thankfully, I saw a couple who was in a little electric motorboat. It had 3 speeds, essentially: slow, even slower, and off. So it was not a fast ride, but it was a way to get out on the water. And thankfully, I was able to figure out, with essentially no German language skills at the time, and with a person who had no English skills and was able to rent one of these little boats, get out on the lake and capture this image. And it took the better part, probably a good half day, I would say, in all of this. I mean, part of that included getting lunch. Thankfully, it was a somewhat overcast day, and so the light wasn't going to be changing dramatically. I wasn't missing early morning light or anything like that. But it made me realize that even when you're just totally in awe of a place or a subject or whatever it might be, something that you're photographing, even when you're immediately awed by that subject, it can take some time to find the right way to photograph a scene. And so I think over the years, I've gotten better at realizing when I had gotten versus not gotten a photograph. And more importantly, if a subject impresses me or inspires me, then I will take the time to try to get the best photo possible, to try to keep working that subject, working that scene, until I feel that I have a photo that I'm going to be happy with. And sometimes I get home and realize I'm still not that happy with it, and sometimes I get home and it's better than I expected, or maybe it takes a little bit of work in post-processing to get it to look the right way. But again, trying to make sure that you're taking the time. I think part of this is, for example, planning a trip in such a way that you'll have enough time. One of my favorite ways of traveling is a road trip, and usually with a road trip, I try to have, if anything, only a very loose plan, in that I want to be able to, if we get to a location that really is kind of inspiring me photographically, that we can stop and stay for a few days, couple days, whatever the case might be, versus some of these trips where, okay, you're here now, you get to photograph for an hour, then we're moving on to the next location. If you take a bus trip, for example, where you have no control over the schedule. But whenever possible, if you've got the time available and you've got a subject that inspires you, to make the time to really work that subject and come up with the best photos that you can. In a previous webinar presentation, I talked a lot about planning for a photograph, and so many of you maybe were with me, were on that presentation, or have seen the video later. If you missed it and want the full story, or you want some tips on planning for better photographs, then you can certainly find that on my channel on YouTube, Tim Gray TV on YouTube. But the key here is planning to make sure you're getting a good shot. And for this photo, it really, which partially is a favorite of mine because, as I mentioned at the beginning, when I was much younger, I got my pilot's license. So naturally, as you can imagine, I love basically anything that flies. And so out in the Palouse, I was always very interested in photographing crop dusters. And early on, when I would tell workshop participants that we were going out to try and, photograph a crop duster, the responses would be like, "Oh, why? Why would we do that?" Then they saw what was happening. They had the experience of this plane flying so low over the fields, and they just loved it and wanted to do it again and again. And so there was a lot of planning that went into this. And so creating this photograph that I'm very happy with, it came from a lot of work. And it made me realize that planning can be critical to creating a photograph that you're proud of. And here, it was partially planning from the standpoint of interacting with the locals, getting to know the locals in this place, not just being a stranger, but actually getting to know the people so that we can now coordinate. So I've gotten to know this pilot, and we will go over to his house for a barbecue, and we'll coordinate with him. He'll let us know where he's spraying. We can work together to make sure that we're in a safe position relative to him flying, for one thing, and the wind direction, obviously, hopefully being at our back, blowing that spray away from us, keeping a safe distance away. And then the planning of location. So talking to the pilot and finding out where he's spraying, because ideally I want to be at an elevated position, and I want the hills of the Palouse to be rising up behind the plane so that we get this plane set against this clean background with no sky up in it, helping to emphasize how low he's flying, etc. And then planning in terms of the actual photographic settings. So knowing that I don't want a really fast shutter speed, because I don't want that prop to be frozen by that fast shutter speed. I want a little bit of prop blur. And so all these different things, really just making that point that planning can be a really big part of creating a photograph that you're happy with. Taking all of the different variables into account and trying to do everything you can to tip as many of those variables in your favor as possible. Taking a little bit of time, before you go to a location, get to know the area, figure out where you're going to want to visit, figure out if there's going to be a full moon, or where the sunrise and sunset will be relative to, various key landmarks, for example. So there's all these various ways that you can plan to create better photographs. And then the photo that I never intended to capture, and yet is absolutely one of my favorites, and I'd like to think one of my best photos as well. But again, part of that is my bias, because this was a special moment, and this was an unexpected photo. The photo I thought I was going to capture was a photo at sunset, with a wonderful sunset off to the left, and the Duomo in the frame. I probably would have shot this a little bit wider had that been the case. In this particular situation, I had this shot in my mind and I wanted to go capture it. I had visited Florence a number of times before, got to know this location, the Piazzale Michelangelo, and knew that that was a nice vantage point for the Duomo. Had photographed from there at sunrise, where the sun would be off to the right from this perspective, lighting up the Duomo from the right side. And that was fine, but wasn't as dramatic as I was hoping for. And so the sunset would be off to the left, and we had been in Florence for a few days. This was our final night in Florence, and hustling up to the Piazzale and realizing that since this was my last chance, and really only chance, because the previous days it had been dreary, overcast, and raining, but the clouds had parted a little bit, so we started heading up, walking up the steps to the Piazzale, and realizing about halfway up that this was going to be a bust. And so, the clouds had not parted enough. It was too cloudy out toward the horizon. There was, gaps here and there, but the sun was just going to disappear behind the clouds. One of those sunsets that's, more of a fizzle than a wow kind of a moment. And so I realized that the shot was not going to happen. In many cases, that might be when you're tempted to just turn around, but then I decided, well, let's go up there anyway. And I was able to capture this image a little bit, probably about 20 minutes or so after sunset in the blue hour. And it made me realize that sometimes the best moments come later than you expect them, and that it can be very much worth waiting for those moments. And then my lightning shot. And so I've talked about this image previously in the context of planning. And of course, this photo didn't really involve planning in terms of the lightning bolt that you see striking the tower on the World Trade Center. But there was a lot of planning, obsessive planning, as it turns out, that went into this shot. This was actually during a photo workshop in New York City, and the weather was not cooperating very well. And so trying to figure out when are we going to go to, this location or that. So we've got some locations that we want to visit at a particular time, after sunset, for example, in this case, or afternoon through sunset, late afternoon through sunset from the skyline view over to the west of Manhattan. And so then it's a matter of, okay, I've got this afternoon and that afternoon type of a photo. Where am I going to position these different shots? Meaning schedule, where am I going to schedule? When will we go to Brooklyn for this view? When will we go to New Jersey for the other view? And always obsessing over the weather. And the evening that this photo was taken, the afternoon this photo was taken, the weather was not very good. In fact, there were severe thunderstorms in the area. But I wanted to try to make the most of it, and obsessing over the weather and realizing how things were playing out, I realized that this band of storms, these severe thunderstorms, were going to reach us reasonably soon, but they would only take about an hour to pass over us, and then we could photograph again. And so I decided we'd go over to this location. You can photograph the Empire State Building through the Manhattan Bridge and photograph the Brooklyn Bridge itself, and there's some other views to be had there that are sort of late afternoon shots, but then you've got a little bit of a break because the sun is setting behind Manhattan here, and so you want to wait till the sun actually goes down for the other shots that you'll want to capture. And so we decided we would go over there, get those afternoon shots right before the thunderstorms moved in, and then before the thunderstorms moved in, go to a restaurant nearby and have dinner. And then once the storms passed, go capture some more photographs. And fortunately, through all that planning, we timed it just right, where we got to the restaurant about a half an hour before the real downpour started, where the really violent thunderstorms were coming through. And those who had not obsessed over the weather were caught in the rain and running to try to seek cover. And it took a little while for the storms to pass, so we had dessert, and we had some coffee, and we hung out for a little while. And once the rain subsided, we went over to a coffee shop that would have a view or of more or less of this scene so we could keep an eye on things. And then as the colors started to show up, as the sun got to the gap in the clouds, between the clouds and the horizon, we were treated to this glorious light. And this actually is not even the best photo that I captured of that wonderful color. But I had my camera set to automatically capture bracketed exposures on an interval basis. So I could set up my camera, let it take pictures for me automatically, essentially, while I helped any other photographers who needed help with their camera settings or composition or what have you, or just had general questions. And so as I'm helping some other photographers, this bolt of lightning and the sound, when lightning is really close, it is not even so much thunder as you can sort of hear the electricity snapping through the air, because we're just across the river from where the lightning actually struck. And immediately after that moment, because the storms had passed, there was no more lightning in the area, and then suddenly this bolt comes out of nowhere, it seemed. And so there's that momentary shock of not expecting this to happen. And after the sound of that lightning, the next sound I heard, other than the gasps of all the photographers there, was the mirror of my camera snapping back up. And I realized I had a photo. I didn't know if it was going to be a too bright exposure or a too dark exposure because I was bracketing for HDR. Thankfully, it was that middle exposure, so it was pretty well exposed overall and captured the lightning, which was absolute luck. No question about it. I mean, I knew there had been thunderstorms in the area. There had certainly been plenty of lightning earlier, but I thought all of that was past us. And so I've realized from that sometimes the lucky shots are more fun than the planned shots. Here, with this shot, there was certainly a lot of planning that went into the overall, but you still want to leave a little bit of room for spontaneity, or just luck. but making sure that everything is not necessarily planned with, this rigid approach where nothing changes no matter what. Give yourself a little bit of room for creativity, for spontaneity, for letting things not go as planned. Because, as with the photograph at Blue Hour of the Florence Duomo, that was not the shot that I thought I was going to take that night. I had no intention of that photo. If I had gotten my sunset shot, I might not have stuck around for that Blue Hour photo. But thankfully, in some ways, I had bad luck that night in that I didn't get what I thought I wanted, but then I was lucky, so to speak, in that I stuck around and was able to get a photo that I think actually is even better than what I thought I was going to end up with. And here I definitely did not expect to get a lightning shot. If there had been active lightning, I probably wouldn't have been out there in the first place. And if I really wanted a lightning shot, I'd be out using a lightning trigger. I wouldn't be hoping for luck. So I'll take the luck anytime. And sometimes that luck is more fun than when you've planned out a shot. So I do encourage you to leave room for luck, embrace luck, and also try to make sure that you're having those spontaneous moments as a photographer from time to time as well. And then image number 10, my final favorite photo of these 10 favorites, which, by the way, actually, it was a lot of fun going through my images and thinking about which photos had become my favorites over the years. And sometimes there's changes. A photo that was a favorite is no longer a favorite. Some of them have maintained their favorite status for a while. But this absolutely is one of my favorites. It's a view that I've experienced many times and photographed many times. And this particular shot was just when the conditions had really cooperated very nicely. Very windy conditions, cleared out all the haze, and it was just a really nice view. And for those of you who are not familiar, I certainly was not familiar of this view, of this scene, until my wife wanted to take a tour in a vintage Fiat, which is a very small car for a man of 6 feet tall to squeeze into. But we took that tour, and the tour guide brought us to this location that I'd never seen in any of, the typical tour books or anything. I'm sure it's in many tour books, but not the ones that I had seen. And when we got there, there's this line of people waiting at the door, but the door never opens. Well, actually it does. I've seen it open twice briefly, but the door's not opening. People instead are looking through the keyhole, oftentimes photographing through the keyhole, as I did, and then walking away. And we had no idea what to expect. The tour guide was smart and didn't tell us what was there, just told us to look through the keyhole. And look, we did. And you're looking through this sort of tunnel of hedges to St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City. And so, technically speaking, at least, this view represents 3 countries, all in the same photograph, in that I'm standing in Italy, and the middle ground in front of the Basilica is Italy. The distance, of course, is Vatican City, which technically is, sort of its own country, depending on how you count countries. And the foreground, the view that we're looking through, the keyhole and this hedge maze, or the hedge tunnel here in the foreground, that is the Order of Malta, which is an organization that actually has this, sort of protected status within Italy, within Rome. And the reason that this is a favorite view is obviously in part just how interesting, how cool it looks, and also this sort of mystery of it, so that you go to this little piazza that seems like just almost like a parking lot in a way. It doesn't seem like it's something particularly special, and the door certainly doesn't look like anything particularly special, but I would say that the view is very special, and part of it is that you're looking through a keyhole to see this view. It's maybe a 1-inch diameter keyhole to get this view. And part of it, of course, is the subject matter. Part of it is this perceived compression of the scene. Because we have this little tunnel of foliage, it actually makes the basilica seem larger than it is, relatively speaking. Just down the street, there's another viewpoint with really tall trees, and suddenly you go there, and the basilica, even though you're the same distance away from it, it looks much, much smaller by comparison. And in fact, there's a street in Rome that you could drive down, or ride a bicycle down, I suppose, And as you get closer to the basilica, it looks like the basilica is moving farther away. It's just an optical illusion. So it's a little bit of an illusion, but it makes it seem like you could reach out and touch it. It's so close. And so, in fact, it's one of our favorite views in Rome. Whenever we're in Rome, we always go revisit this location. We've gone during the day and at night and in the morning and the evening, all sorts of different times, and it's always a real special view. And what that made me think about in the context of favorite photos, and part of the reason that this is a favorite photo, is that, yes, this is a viewfinder photo. But whenever I take a group of photographers there, when I'm leading a photo workshop in Rome, I always suggest, because I don't really make the rules, I'm just there as a glorified tour guide, right? But I suggest that they put their cameras down and go look through the keyhole without a camera. And the reason that I have them do that is that I believe that it is important to experience more than the view through your camera's viewfinder. Part of that is finding, literally in this case, a view that you can just savor, that you can just take in without worrying about f-stops and apertures and ISO settings and focal lengths and all these other technicalities. And part of it is having an experience, so trying to make sure that you're not so busy taking pictures that you never really have the experience of what that place is. And so having the experience, as I mentioned right from the beginning, putting the experience first, prioritizing the experience and letting that lead to great photographs instead of always focusing on the photographs first. Obviously, we all want to make great photographs, but trying to make sure that you're having good experiences along the way. Well, thank you very much. If anybody has any questions or comments, it's funny that I happened to put this as the closing image. It was one of the first that was not of true favorite status, but Norman posted a question here. Am I the only one who sees a face in the iceberg photo? And I'm going to have to confess, Norman's going to have to email me a copy of the image with sketching or describe to me where that face is. I'm not seeing it myself. But maybe some of the others joining today can see a face somewhere in there in the iceberg. Sorry, I don't see that. But in any event, thank you very much for joining me today. I hope that today's presentation has been interesting and has been inspirational perhaps on some level and has helped you to be more thoughtful about some of the things you can do to help ensure that you are capturing as many favorite photos as possible. And I mentioned some of the photo workshops that I lead, New York City, Rome. It looks like we'll be leading a photo workshop in Austria again. I showed a photo from Austria and Hallstatt. That will certainly be part of that workshop. If you're interested in joining me, you can visit my website, timgrayphoto.com/workshops for information about all of the upcoming workshops that we have planned for the next year or two. In the meantime, thanks very much for joining me. I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join me for these presentations. And once again, I hope that it was helpful and inspirational. So thank you very much, and I'll hope to see you on a future webinar presentation. And thanks, by the way, speaking of these webinar presentations, thank you to Tamron for sponsoring these presentations, making all of this possible. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.